I know this game is over a year old by now, but I just finished it recently, which I guess could say something about how good it is, though considering how long it is and how many life changes I've had recently, maybe not. The downside to reviewing the game so long after its release is that so much has already been said about it. But the upside to that is that I can try to approach the discussion from a different angle, because frankly, even now, all talk of Andromeda is incredibly reductive and hateful. To hear most people talk about it, Andromeda is nothing more than a broken mess, completely devoid of value, and has completely ruined Mass Effect forever. As though anything could do the series worse than the last 10 minutes of Mass Effect 3. So for this review, sure, I'll go over the basic elements of the game and how well they do or don't come together, but I'm gonna try to do something a bit different by reviewing the game as it exists now, rather than as it existed on release, since some of the more egregious problems have been fixed in patches. I'm also going to actually talk about how the game comes together instead of just complaining about all the problems it has, which, I'm sure others have done, but the internet as a whole doesn't seem to know about it, so I'm gonna try and add a voice to that particular conversation. Mass Effect Andromeda is a spin-off of the original Mass Effect trilogy. Andromeda follows a group of people from all alien races of the Mass Effect universe who were sent to the Andromeda galaxy sometime between the events of Mass Effect 1 and 2. Your character is the human Pathfinder, sort of the leader of colonization efforts once reaching the new galaxy, and when faced with a variety of complications that hadn't been known when the ships left hundreds of years earlier, you're tasked with unearthing ancient technology, finding the other scattered ships from the Andromeda Initiative, befriending another species with its own history and culture, and pushing back against a hostile alien race that wants to absorb all the others into its collective. The first thing worth talking about from this basic premise is the way the story and setting contribute to a bit of a different open-world narrative structure than most games tend to go for. Functionally, on a mechanical level, it's pretty normal. You have your main story missions that move the story forward, and a bunch of side missions that contribute in other, less important ways. And in true Mass Effect style, the side missions can affect the story in some ways, so it helps to at least do some of them. But Andromeda is made not to feel like a particularly plot-driven game. There are always new story missions that will move the plot forward, but the overall goal of Andromeda for a good portion of the game is literally just to find new planets, explore them, and make them habitable for living, and set up outposts so people can actually start living there. The goal is inherently more nebulous and requires more just getting out there and trying things and looking for stuff than the usual process of progressing through these stories. The result is a weird mix, because the game definitely gets Skyrimmed in that it has a lot of side missions that don't always contribute meaningfully to the story at large, but it also means that most of the stuff you do doesn't feel all that useless because it's contributing to your overall goal. The more habitable a planet is, the better the conditions for the people living there, and the more you can work to make the Andromeda galaxy a home. The game tracks this in a number of ways, and progressing this habitability enables a lot of progression through the story and through character beats, so it makes your progression feel tangible on a narrative level despite the nebulous concepts and goals the story mostly deals in. It's a very different way to try and approach open-world storytelling, even if it uses some classic formulas to do it, and the results are somewhat mixed, but it does present something of a unique, interesting, and I think decently successful way of changing the way that we approach these kinds of open-world stories. All this makes the game feel a little less structured, like there's just a series of things you have to do that all contribute to a larger goal, which in turn allows for the game to make your actions feel like they really do have tangible consequences. Not just because this big thing you did came back later, but because even little things could have big consequences, or random side quests can contribute to the cast or the ending in meaningful ways. Narrative threads will weave in and out of the spotlight, often tangling together with others for a time before going their separate ways again, and just about all of them will factor into the ending in ways that don't necessarily change much about how it turns out, but absolutely make you feel like the people you've helped and the homes you've built are contributing to your victory in this greater struggle. Even though the implementation of this more complex structure is something of a mixed bag, I can't deny that the payoff in the end was quite emotionally satisfying. I do feel like I can't talk about Andromeda without addressing this sorta awkward issue of colonialism, since the game is about launching into an unexplored area that already has natives living there, but I think the game handles it rather tastefully. At every turn, the player is given the option to work with the Angara, to legitimately help them and turn to them in situations where their perspective matters more than that of outsiders, or the consequences would disproportionately affect them. I'm not an expert on these issues, and I'm sure someone with more knowledge about the historical implications of colonialism would have more to say on the matter, but I think the game handles that aspect of the story very well. Of course, the real draw of a BioWare game is the characters, and Andromeda's cast is mostly pretty good. Mass Effect games have always had a whole bunch of really interesting cast members, and then one or two who just super weren't. And Andromeda is no exception, but for the most part, the characters are very engaging, and I enjoyed getting to know them over the course of the game. I do wish BioWare would just stop making all their in-game dialogue so easily and permanently interruptible, so I wouldn't constantly be missing out on character development because someone saw a space beetle like 10 miles away from my freaking vehicle, but what can you do? The one complaint I do have about the characters relative to how these things were handled in previous Mass Effect games is that I felt I never really had enough to talk to my crew members about, and didn't have nearly enough opportunities to interact with my love interest in particular. I also continue to be annoyed at how little attention is given to the less human-looking alien races when it comes to the game's romance and sexual scenes. It makes it pretty clear that the game is more concerned with titillation than actually using these scenes to advance all romance arcs equally, which I find kind of frustrating. Overall, I had a great time getting to know the characters, learning why they left everything behind for this mission and what demons still haunted them in this new galaxy, despite the fact that I really just wanted a lot more focus on them. The game certainly does still have its fair share of glitches, and while some of them did take me out of the experience a bit every now and again, none of them posed any particularly huge problem. So yeah, problem, imperfection, but not necessarily a huge stumbling block to enjoying the game. As for the visuals, even after the patches, Andromeda's character models and animations leave a lot to be desired. They're vastly improved since launch, so they're not nearly as distracting as all the complaints and memes make them out to be, but with some characters in particular, it's hard not to notice the poor quality of facial animations and weirdly bad hair texturing. But mostly, it's passable, rarely distracting, which isn't exactly high praise, but at least means it doesn't get in the way of the stuff that really matters. And for whatever it may be worth, no one ever talks about the fact that the facial animation problems only really relate to the human characters. Some of the alien animations are actually quite excellent, and the villainous Ket in particular have some very expressive faces. Now that the patches have smoothed over the game's technical issues and poor animations, we're left with a passable, if unremarkable, visual experience. When it comes to the characters, at least, the game does deserve credit for its environments. Mass Effect Andromeda is one of the best games for beautiful space environments in recent years. From beautiful vistas on strange alien worlds to the images of large planets hanging in the void of space, Andromeda is incredibly pretty to look at when there aren't human character models involved. Honestly, despite all the complaints about the animations and such, the combat gameplay is where Andromeda actually falls apart for me. The basic moment-by-moment combat is fine, it functions alright, and I could enjoy it after a while, but between its use of auto-cover, which is, in my opinion, one of the few game mechanics that is just never a good idea, and its tendency to use swarms of samey enemies with the occasional bullet sponge, it just wasn't as engaging as past titles. To make things worse, the game's menu interfaces are a complete and total mess. I appreciate the game's attempt to go back to the higher levels of customization I liked about the first Mass Effect game, but as weird as it sounds, the interface to actually make use of that customization is so ugly and crowded and confusing that I very rarely actually took advantage of it. I just didn't want to deal with the actual process. Probably didn't help that I was playing Persona 5 around the same time, and that game is a masterclass in menu design, but still, it shocks me that a team of UI designers at BioWare could have churned out something this ugly and unusable. While I eventually learned to accept Andromeda's gameplay on its own terms enough to enjoy it alright, the unfortunate fact is that the act of actually playing the game left a pretty big stain on my appreciation of it. So yes, there's a lot to complain about here. Andromeda is indeed a mess in many ways, but what I'd like to put forward is that sometimes messes hide something actually worthwhile underneath them. And while Andromeda is no hidden masterpiece, it definitely has a worthwhile experience underneath all the junk we're obsessing over. It has an inspiring story about the triumph of community and will over uniformity and inhabitability, a lot of legitimately thought-provoking science fiction scenarios, some beautiful space porn, a colorful cast of characters, and a far more satisfying ending than the actual Mass Effect trilogy got. Basically, it has the stuff we love about Mass Effect. It never quite reaches the height of the original trilogy, but it is all there. It's just in a bit of a rougher package. And while that does make it hard to recommend without qualification, I think it's time we stop defining this entire product by those rough edges and start acknowledging that there's more to a work than the things that annoy us about it. So overall, in Games is Lit 101, Mass Effect Andromeda gets a C, and a recommendation to anyone who has a bit of patience and a love of good sci-fi.